15. Worst ways. Black pastors died. Heartbreaking losses. When you hear the word pastor, you imagine peace wisdom and a voice guiding people closer to God. But what if I told you that some of the most powerful black pastors met their end in ways so violent, sudden, and heartbreaking that their congregations were left in shock? From brutal murders to collapsing mid-sermon, from assassinations to years trapped in silence, their stories are as haunting as they are unforgettable. Stay with us as we uncover 15 of the worst ways black pastors have died. Before we begin, hit subscribe and join Legends of Black Excellence. Paul Jones. Reverend Paul Jones was a man whose destiny seemed wrapped in music and ministry. Born in Houston, Texas, he carried a voice that could move even the hardest hearts. When he sang, it wasn't just performance, it was a spiritual experience. His voice rose with conviction, dipped with tenderness, and soared with a power that left congregations trembling. People described his singing as both thunder and velvet, capable of reaching heaven while anchoring the weary here on earth. His most celebrated song, "I Won't Complain," became more than a melody. It was a testimony of perseverance. Crowds sang it with him, tears in their eyes, because the words spoke to their own struggles. Pastors admired his preaching, musicians respected his artistry, and fans believed he was only at the beginning of a career that could redefine gospel for a new generation. At only 30 years old, Paul Jones was a rare figure who balanced the pulpit with the microphone, and both seemed to welcome him with open arms. But promise doesn't always protect from tragedy. In September of 1990, Paul Jones was discovered murdered in his Houston home, stabbed more than 20 times. It wasn't a robbery or a random act of violence. The brutality showed rage, the kind only possible from someone who knew him well. Investigators later revealed the heartbreaking truth: the attacker was a man he had trusted. The horror deepened when church members, alarmed after Paul missed a service, walked into his home and found his body. The image of faithful believers stumbling upon their pastor in such a condition seared itself into gospel history. For many, it felt unthinkable, a man who had just sung about trust in God, who had given hope through every note cut down in his own sanctuary. His death left the gospel world in shock. It wasn't just the loss of talent, it was the loss of innocence. Fans asked how a pastor, a shepherd of souls, could be betrayed so viciously. His story forced many to face uncomfortable truths about human weakness, envy, and anger. For his family, congregation, and the wider community, the pain lingered long after the funeral. Yet Paul's legacy did not vanish with him. His recordings continued to echo through churches, radios, and gospel concerts. "I Won't Complain" became a song of remembrance, carrying new weight with every note. People sang it not only as a hymn of resilience, but also as a tribute to the man who had embodied it. Even though his voice was silenced, the message he left behind remained louder than the violence that ended his life. More than 3 decades later, his story still speaks. Paul Jones reminds us of the fragility of life and the shocking reality that tomorrow is never guaranteed. He also reminds us that the power of a voice filled with truth and spirit can live far longer than the person behind it. His tragic end will never erase the light he brought, and in every congregation where his songs are sung, his spirit continues to minister. Sean Jones. Pastor Sean Jones was more than a preacher. He was a force of gospel energy whose presence lit up every stage he stepped onto. Born and raised in Alabama, he carried the charm of the South with a voice that blended old-school gospel grit with youthful fire. People described his singing as anointed but electric, a sound that could take you back to the roots of church revival while making you feel the excitement of something brand new. By his early 30s, Sean had become the front man of Sean Jones and the Believers, a group that quickly gained recognition across Southern churches. They weren't polished in a commercial sense. What made them powerful was their raw passion, their harmonies, and Sean's ability to sing like every note was his last. His style made people think of the legends of gospel, yet his charisma was entirely his own. Audiences loved how he poured himself out completely, never holding back. On November 18th, 2017, that passion carried him onto the stage of a small church in Pensacola, Florida. The room was packed, the air charged with anticipation. As Sean led his group through a set filled with praise and worship, people clapped, shouted, and cried. Then, without warning, his body gave out. In the middle of the performance, he collapsed. At first, the audience thought he might have fainted from exhaustion. But as minutes passed and panic filled the sanctuary, the grim reality became clear. Sean Jones, only 32 years old, had suffered a fatal heart attack. Can you imagine the shock of hearing your favorite pastor singing with all his might, one moment only to see him fall silent forever? The next news spread quickly, with videos from that night circulating online. The sight of him collapsing mid-song haunted fans who had just been celebrating with him. For many, it seemed almost symbolic. Sean literally sang until he could no longer sing. Supporters said he sang himself into glory, a comforting phrase that softened the blow, but could not erase the devastation of losing such a vibrant life so suddenly. The tragedy felt heavier because of what might have been. Sean Jones was just entering the prime of his career. He had the kind of talent that could have propelled him into the national gospel spotlight, filling arenas and recording albums that would inspire generations. Instead, his journey ended in a small church before a stunned audience. His group, the Believers, was left without its leader, and fans were left without the voice they believed could carry gospel into a new era. At his funeral, hundreds came to honor him, and tributes poured in from across the gospel world. The sadness was profound, not just because of his youth, but because of the way his life ended in the very place he loved most, doing exactly what he was called to do. To many, that brought bittersweet comfort. Though his time was short, his final moments were spent praising God, giving everything he had to his ministry. Even now, his legacy lingers. People still share his performances online, marveling at the intensity and sincerity of his delivery. His sudden death serves as both an inspiration and a warning. Life is fragile, and even the most passionate among us are not promised tomorrow. Pastor Sean Jones may have only had 32 years, but in those years he left a mark that will not fade, proving that sometimes a voice doesn't have to echo for long to be unforgettable. Martin Luther King Jr. Before the world knew him as the face of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. was first and foremost a preacher. Born in Atlanta in 1929, he followed the footsteps of his father, Martin Luther King Sr., becoming a Baptist minister with a deep conviction that faith could be a weapon against injustice. From the pulpit of Ebenezer Baptist Church, King delivered sermons that were equal parts theology and prophecy, igniting a flame in congregations that would spread across America. His voice carried a rhythm of Southern preaching mixed with moral urgency, reminding listeners that righteousness was not just an idea, but a demand. King's rise into history was never about political ambition alone. It was grounded in his identity as a pastor. His sermons gave shape to movements. His marches felt like walking church services. He used biblical imagery to demand civil rights, turning passages about justice into rallying cries for freedom. By the time he delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech in Washington, he was not just speaking to a crowd of 250,000, he was pastoring a nation wounded by segregation and racism. Yet beneath the soaring speeches was a man under constant threat. Bomb threats, arrests, and brutal attacks were part of his daily reality. Still, King never carried a weapon. He believed his calling was to fight hate with nonviolence, even as his enemies sharpened their knives and loaded their guns. His faith told him that peace had to be more than words. It had to be lived even at the cost of his own safety. On April 4th, 1968, at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, King leaned over the balcony outside his room. He was only 39 years old, talking and laughing with colleagues about the evening ahead. In an instant, a sniper's bullet struck him in the neck, ending his life and silencing one of the most powerful voices of the 20th century. News of his assassination sparked riots in over 100 American cities, leaving a trail of grief and anger that underscored the magnitude of his loss. James Earl Ray, a career criminal, was arrested and eventually pleaded guilty to the assassination, though conspiracy theories have swirled for decades about whether others were involved. What is certain is that the image of King's body lying on that balcony with his friends pointing toward the shooter's direction remains one of the most haunting photographs in American memory. For his congregation, the tragedy was doubly painful. They lost not only a civil rights leader but also their pastor. For the broader Black church, his death symbolized the cost of speaking truth to power. And for the nation, it revealed that even those who fight with peace can be destroyed by violence. Yet King's legacy was not buried with him. His sermons still echo in churches. His speeches are studied in schools, and his philosophy of nonviolent resistance continues to inspire global movements for justice. Streets, schools, and monuments bear his name, but more importantly, millions still march in the spirit of his dream. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. may have died by a bullet, but his words outlived the assassin's gunfire. His life and death remind us that a pastor's calling can reach far beyond the church walls, shaping history itself. And though his dream was interrupted on that balcony in Memphis, the vision he cast has never stopped moving forward. Clementa Carlos Pinckney. Reverend Clementa Carlos Pinckney was a man whose life embodied both spiritual devotion and civic responsibility. Born on July 30th, 1973 in Beaufort, South Carolina, he seemed destined for leadership from an early age. By the time he was 18, he was already licensed to preach, and not long after, he became the youngest African Methodist Episcopal minister in his state. His faith was never separated from his sense of duty. To Pinckney, being a pastor meant not only shepherding a congregation, but also working to uplift communities through justice and equality. His ministry took him to the pulpit of Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, one of the oldest Black churches in the South, a place with a rich history rooted in both worship and resistance. Known for his booming baritone voice and calm demeanor, Pinckney could command attention without raising his tone. His presence filled the sanctuary, and his sermons often blended scripture with real-world issues: poverty, racial injustice, and the need for compassion. But he wasn't confined to the church. At just 23 years old, he was elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives, and later, at 27, he became the youngest African American elected to the state Senate. By 41, he had built a reputation as a bridge between politics and the pulpit, carrying himself with quiet authority and grace. June 17, 2015 began as an ordinary Wednesday evening at Emmanuel AME. Reverend Pinckney gathered with church members for Bible study, one of the most sacred and peaceful practices of Christian life. Among the group was a young white man, Dylan Roof, who sat with them for nearly an hour as they read scripture and prayed together. No one could have imagined the darkness he carried inside. After closing his Bible, Roof pulled out a gun and opened fire. Within minutes, the sanctuary became a scene of unimaginable horror. Reverend Pinckney and 8 other parishioners were killed in cold blood. The Charleston church massacre shocked the nation. A house of God supposed to be a place of safety and refuge had been desecrated by hatred. Pinckney, who had dedicated his life to building unity, was cut down by a man consumed with division. The aftermath was raw and painful. Vigils were held across South Carolina, and the images of grieving families filled television screens. President Barack Obama attended the funeral and delivered a moving eulogy, even breaking into the hymn "Amazing Grace" in front of thousands. The massacre reignited debates about race gun violence and the Confederate flag, which was still flying over the South Carolina State House at the time. Within weeks, the flag was finally removed, a symbolic gesture spurred by the sacrifice of lives in Charleston. For his congregation, losing Pinckney meant losing not only a pastor, but also a mentor, a friend, and a voice of reason. For South Carolina, his absence left a hole in the political landscape, as few leaders possessed his ability to bring people together with such dignity. For the nation, his death became another painful reminder of how racism continues to claim lives, even in the most sacred of places. And yet his legacy lives on. His wife and 2 daughters carry his memory with resilience. His church, Emmanuel AME, still stands as a symbol of endurance, faith, and hope. Every year, people gather to remember the Emmanuel 9, ensuring their names are never forgotten. Reverend Pinckney's life, though ended by hate, continues to shine as a beacon of love and service. Reverend Clementa Pinckney believed that faith was not passive, it was action, sacrifice, and courage. Though his life was stolen in one of the darkest moments in modern church history, his story reminds us that light shines brightest in the face of darkness, and that the work of justice he lived for must continue. James Moore Sr. Reverend James Moore Sr. was the kind of gospel singer and preacher you never forgot once you heard him. Born in Detroit, Michigan in 1956, Moore grew up surrounded by music and church life. His voice stood out even as a child, carrying an intensity and depth far beyond his years. By the time he reached adulthood, he had developed a reputation for a vocal style that could soar high with passion and then drop low with gut-wrenching soul, leaving audiences breathless. People said that when James Moore sang, he didn't just hit notes, he pulled you into the song until you felt every word in your bones. His ministry was inseparable from his music. Moore wasn't simply a performer, he was a preacher whose sermons carried the same fire as his songs. Some of his most beloved recordings, like He Was There All the Time and I Will Trust in the Lord, became staples in churches across America. He was the type of artist who could walk into a sanctuary, sit at the piano, and transform an ordinary service into an unforgettable encounter with the divine. Fans described him as larger than life, not because of his fame, but because of the overwhelming presence he carried when he ministered. Yet behind the pulpit and the stage, Reverend Moore lived with a quiet battle. In his early 40s, he was diagnosed with diabetes, a disease that began to chip away at his health. It wasn't just a small inconvenience, it was a heavy cross to carry. His energy would fade, his body weakened, and soon he was forced to begin dialysis. For many gospel lovers, it was painful to watch a man with such strength slowly worn down by illness. But each time he stepped into the spotlight, he sang with such conviction that you would never guess the toll his condition was taking. By the late 1990s, his health struggles became more visible. Yet he refused to let sickness define him. He continued traveling, preaching, and recording as much as he could, insisting that the ministry God had given him was greater than the disease he carried. Admirers often spoke of his resilience, noting how even when his body seemed frail, his voice remained thunderous, as if it came from a well that illness could not touch. On June 7, 2000, the gospel world was struck with devastating news. Reverend James Moore Sr. had died at just 44 years old, the official cause linked to kidney failure brought on by complications from diabetes. His passing felt unfair, a cruel twist of fate for someone who had given so much and still had so much more to offer. Fans mourned not only a beloved singer, but a preacher whose ministry had shaped countless lives. His funeral drew an outpouring of love and remembrance, with choirs singing his classics and ministers recalling how his example had inspired them. For those left behind, the recordings became a lifeline. Songs like He Was There All the Time now carried even more meaning, as if Moore himself were reminding listeners from beyond the grave that God's presence never fades even in tragedy. Though his life was cut short, James Moore Sr.'s legacy continues to echo. His unique blend of preaching and singing influenced a generation of gospel artists who came after him. His recordings are still played in churches, and his voice still stirs hearts decades after his passing. In the end, his story is one of triumph in the face of suffering, a reminder that even when illness steals years, it cannot silence a soul filled with faith. James Cleveland. Reverend James Cleveland's name is etched in history as the king of gospel music. Born on December 5, 1931 in Chicago, Illinois, He was raised in a city where the black church was more than a house of worship. It was a cultural and social anchor. As a boy, Cleveland's raspy voice made him stand out, and instead of seeing it as a weakness, he turned it into his greatest strength. That gravelly tone, paired with a natural sense of rhythm and conviction, would eventually carry gospel into the mainstream. Cleveland began his career with the legendary gospel group The Caravans, alongside Albertina Walker. His unique delivery, half preaching, half singing, quickly made him unforgettable. By the 1960s and 1970s, he was releasing hits that would become gospel standards, including Peace Be Still and Lord Help Me to Hold Out. With each performance, he pushed gospel further into the national spotlight, blending traditional church sounds with modern arrangements. He didn't just sing songs. He built choirs, nurtured young talent, and created a gospel empire that shaped the sound of worship for decades. His legacy was also institutional. Cleveland founded the Gospel Music Workshop of America in 1968, giving thousands of aspiring singers, musicians, and songwriters a platform to learn, share, and perform. Under his leadership, the workshop became the largest gospel music organization in the world. For countless artists, it was the stepping stone to careers that carried gospel into every corner of the globe. But behind the curtain of success, Cleveland's health was crumbling. Years of obesity strained his heart and led to a chain of medical complications. By the late 1980s, rumors began spreading about his declining health, and the once unstoppable giant seemed visibly weaker. He kept performing and ministering, but those close to him could see that his body was fighting battles his voice could no longer mask. On February 9, 1991, Reverend James Cleveland died in Culver City, California, at the age of 59. The official cause was heart failure, though it was clear his years of health struggles had caught up with him. For fans, the news felt impossible. How could the man whose songs had held people together through their darkest days suddenly be gone? The mourning that followed was massive. His funeral drew not just friends and family, but some of the biggest names in gospel and beyond. Choirs sang his classics, filling the air with the very music he had helped create. The grief was matched only by the celebration of his contributions, a reminder that though the man had passed, the music would endure. For the gospel community, his death marked the end of an era. He wasn't just a singer or a preacher, he was the architect of modern gospel. Without James Cleveland, the genre might never have reached the global recognition it enjoys today. He left behind not only recordings, but also choirs, workshops, and an entire infrastructure designed to keep gospel thriving for future generations. Even decades later, his songs still echo in sanctuaries around the world. Choirs continue to belt out Peace Be Still, and congregations still cling to the hope found in Lord Help Me to Hold Out. These performances serve as living proof that James Cleveland's spirit lives on, not in his fragile body, but in the sound of gospel music itself. Reverend James Cleveland's story is both inspiring and sobering. He built an empire of worship, lifted millions with his raspy, unforgettable voice, and yet succumbed to the same health struggles that plague many. In life, he taught people how to praise. In death, he reminded them that even kings cannot outrun mortality, but their legacies can. Walter Hawkins. Bishop Walter Lee Hawkins was born on May 18, 1949 in Oakland, California, into a family steeped in music and faith. From a young age, he absorbed the rhythms of gospel, surrounded by the songs that pulsed through black churches in the Bay Area. His older brother, Edwin Hawkins, would one day take the world by storm with Oh Happy Day. But Walter carved his own unique place in gospel history. Whereas Edwin carried the banner of crossover success, Walter offered something equally valuable: soulful sincerity and a pastoral presence that touched lives deeply. Hawkins rose to prominence in the 1970s, not just as Edwin's younger brother, but as a leader in his own right. His debut solo project, Love Alive, released in 1975, became one of the most successful gospel albums of its time. It sold over 1 million copies, a staggering achievement in a genre often confined to churches. The series of Love Alive albums would later cement his reputation as a gospel innovator, blending traditional hymns with smooth soul arrangements that appealed to both the old and the young. Songs like Changed and Be Grateful became instant classics still sung in choirs across America. What set Walter apart was his ability to merge artistry with ministry. As a pastor of Love Center Church in Oakland, he didn't just preach, he lived alongside his congregation. His church was known for its warmth, inclusivity, and its embrace of gospel music as a tool for healing. For Walter, every note was a sermon, every lyric a testimony. People didn't just attend his services, they experienced them. Yet even the most vibrant voices can be silenced by illness. By the late 2000s, Bishop Hawkins was facing a battle few knew about publicly: pancreatic cancer, one of the most aggressive and unforgiving diseases. Quietly, his health declined. Those closest to him noticed the toll it took on his once energetic frame, but he remained steadfast in ministry, determined to keep giving as long as he could. On July 11, 2010, at the age of 61, Bishop Walter Hawkins passed away at his home in Ripon, California. The news rippled quickly through the gospel community. Fans and fellow musicians alike struggled to reconcile the loss of a man whose music had so often comforted others in their grief. To many, it felt impossible that the gentle, soaring voice behind Be Grateful had been silenced. Tributes poured in from around the world. Gospel artists like Yolanda Adams and Donnie McClurkin hailed him as a pioneer who had reshaped the sound of worship. Choirs across the country dedicated services in his honor, filling sanctuaries with the very songs he had composed. His funeral was not just a farewell. It was a concert of praise filled with gratitude for the life he lived and sorrow for the years cut short. Walter Hawkins's death highlighted the cruel speed of pancreatic cancer. Often diagnosed late, the disease leaves little time for recovery, and his passing became a sobering reminder of life's fragility. Yet it also showcased resilience. Even in sickness, Hawkins never abandoned his calling. He chose to spend his final years doing what he loved: preaching, singing, and nurturing his church family. His influence didn't fade with his death. The Love Alive albums remain among the most celebrated works in gospel, teaching new generations how to blend faith with artistry. His church continues his mission of compassion, and his family especially, Edwin, carried forward the Hawkins musical legacy. Walter Hawkins was more than a bishop and more than a singer. He was a vessel of encouragement, a man whose quiet spirit belied the power of his art. Though cancer claimed his body, his music remains immortal. In every choir that lifts Be Grateful, in every congregation that finds strength in Changed, Bishop Walter Hawkins still ministers, proving that love alive in song never truly dies. Norman Hutchins. Pastor Norman Hutchins was born on September 27, 1962 in Delaware, and from the beginning his life was tied to church pews and gospel music. By his teenage years, his extraordinary voice had already caught attention, carrying a tone both smooth and powerful, the kind that could make a sanctuary shake. He wasn't just a talented singer, he was a man who lived and breathed the message of his music. Hutchins's rise in the gospel world was marked by determination and creativity. He released several albums that reached wide audiences, with songs like God's Got a Blessing with My Name on It and Battlefield becoming staples in churches across America. His lyrics carried themes of perseverance, hope, and faith in the midst of storms. Listeners found themselves encouraged by his work because they knew he wasn't just singing catchy tunes, he was pouring scripture and lived testimony into every verse. At the same time, Hutchins dedicated himself to pastoral ministry. As founder of Frontline Ministries in Dover, Delaware, he created a space where worship was vibrant community. Outreach was strong, and gospel music was inseparable from preaching. He became known not only for his voice, but also for his ability to shepherd people through their struggles, always with a smile and a word of encouragement. But even as he encouraged others, his own body carried a hidden war. Diagnosed with diabetes, Hutchins faced a disease that slowly and painfully altered the course of his life. Complications mounted over the years, and eventually both of his legs were amputated. For most, such a blow would mean retreat, a quiet disappearance from public ministry. But Hutchins refused to give up. He rolled into churches in his wheelchair, leading worship with the same passion he had always carried. His resilience became as much a part of his testimony as his music. For Hutchins, it wasn't about appearances, it was about faith. He showed people that joy was not dependent on perfect health and that God's calling could not be canceled by disease. Audiences often wept as they watched him minister because his presence was living proof of endurance. His voice, still clear and commanding, seemed to rise above the limitations of his body, carrying strength that inspired everyone who heard him. Despite his unshakable spirit, the long-term battle took its toll. Diabetes is relentless, and after decades of managing complications, Hutchins' health declined. On August 14, 2025, the gospel community received the devastating news Pastor Norman Hutchins had passed away at the age of 62. His death marked the end of an era because he wasn't just another gospel artist, he was a living reminder of faith in action. Tributes came pouring in from fellow pastors, musicians, and fans who had been touched by his ministry. Many reflected on how his songs had carried them through personal valleys. "God's Got a Blessing" became an anthem of resilience, and after his passing it felt even more powerful, a reminder that Hutchins's life was itself a blessing to countless believers. At his funeral, choirs lifted their voices in the very songs he had written, transforming grief into praise. Friends remembered him not for his illness, but for his refusal to let it define him. His legacy became one of courage, a man who never stopped doing what he loved, even when life took so much from him. Pastor Norman Hutchins's story is more than tragedy, it is testimony. He showed the world that faith is not about avoiding storms, but praising through them. Though his body has gone, his message remains echoing in every lyric, every sermon, and every believer who chooses to keep pressing forward no matter the cost. Eddie Lee Long. Bishop Eddie Lee Long was one of the most recognized pastors in America, a man whose ministry drew tens of thousands and whose influence stretched far beyond the walls of his church. Born on May 12, 1953 in Charlotte, North Carolina, he rose from humble beginnings to become the senior pastor of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Lithonia, Georgia. Under his leadership, the congregation exploded from a few hundred members in the late 1980s to more than 25,000 worshipers at its peak, making it one of the largest megachurches in the United States. Long was a master of the pulpit. His sermons were fiery, passionate, and delivered with the confidence of a man who believed he was chosen for greatness. Dressed in tailored suits and known for his commanding stage presence, he presented himself as both spiritual leader and cultural icon. He authored books, appeared on television, and mentored countless young pastors who wanted to model their ministries after his. For many in Georgia and beyond, Eddie Long symbolized success in ministry, blending faith with ambition in ways that attracted national attention. But alongside admiration came controversy. His opulent lifestyle, luxury cars, fine clothing, and a mansion sparked debates about whether pastors should live like kings while preaching humility. The scrutiny intensified over time, and in the last decade of his life, Long faced lawsuits and scandals that threatened to overshadow his ministry. Still, through storms of criticism, he maintained his position at New Birth, continuing to preach to thousands who still saw him as their shepherd. Then came 2016, when congregants noticed something startling. Bishop Long, once broad-shouldered and physically imposing, appeared dramatically thinner. Pictures of his frail frame circulated online, sparking rumors about his health. Long himself addressed the speculation, attributing his weight loss to a new diet, insisting he was in recovery, and that God was restoring him. Yet behind the brave words, his body told a different story. By early 2017, the truth could no longer be hidden. Bishop Eddie Long was gravely ill, fighting an aggressive form of cancer. On January 15, 2017, at just 63 years old, he died, leaving behind a shocked congregation and a divided legacy. For those who had looked up to him, The speed of his decline was almost unbearable. One year they saw him preaching with fiery authority. The next they were mourning a man barely recognizable in his final days. The news of his death rippled across the nation. Thousands attended his funeral, and tributes poured in from pastors, political leaders, and gospel figures who acknowledged his impact. Yet his passing also reignited debates about his controversies, creating a complex narrative. Was Bishop Eddie Long a man undone by scandal, or a pastor whose imperfections didn't erase the countless lives he touched? What cannot be denied is the scale of his influence. He transformed New Birth into a megachurch that became a spiritual home for celebrities, politicians, and ordinary believers alike. He oversaw charitable projects, community programs, and outreach initiatives that helped the poor and disenfranchised. At the same time, he pushed the boundaries of what pastoral leadership looked like in modern America, for better and for worse. Bishop Long's death was not just the end of a man. It was the end of an era in Black megachurch culture. His life story is a study in contrasts, vision and controversy, triumph and tragedy, power and fragility. In the end, cancer stripped away the image of invincibility, reminding everyone that no matter how grand the stage, mortality cannot be avoided. Clarence LaVaughn Franklin. Reverend Clarence LaVaughn. Franklin, widely known as C.L. Franklin, was more than a pastor. He was a cultural force. Born on January 22, 1915 in Sunflower County, Mississippi, Franklin rose from humble beginnings to become one of the most famous preachers of the 20th century. With his booming baritone voice rich in cadence and conviction, he became known as the man with the $1,000,000 voice. His sermons were so electrifying that they were recorded, sold as albums, and broadcast on the radio, transforming preaching into an art form that reached far beyond church walls. Franklin's ministry took root at New Bethel Baptist Church in Detroit, where he pastored for decades. His sermons often blended theology with calls for social justice, aligning him closely with the civil rights movement. In fact, Franklin was a friend and supporter of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., frequently opening his church to rallies and meetings that advanced the cause of equality. His platform wasn't limited to preaching. He became an advocate for voting rights, economic justice, and community empowerment. But Franklin was also a man of music. His love for gospel and spirituals flowed into his household, shaping the environment in which his daughter Aretha Franklin, the future Queen of Soul, grew up. It was in the pews of New Bethel that Aretha honed her voice, inspired by her father's powerful preaching and the music that filled the sanctuary. In many ways, his influence extended far beyond the pulpit. His legacy became part of American music history itself. However, greatness does not shield from tragedy. On June 10, 1979, Franklin's life took a violent turn. While at his home in Detroit, he was the victim of a robbery gone wrong. Intruders broke into his residence, and during the chaos, Franklin was shot twice in the chest at point-blank range. The attack shocked his congregation and the nation. Against the odds, he survived, but the wounds were catastrophic. He never fully recovered. Instead of returning to the pulpit, Franklin slipped into a coma that would last nearly 5 years. His once commanding voice, which had electrified thousands, was silenced. His home became a place of vigil where his family, including Aretha, cared for him with hope that he might one day awaken. But that miracle never came. On July 27, 1984, Reverend C.L. Franklin died at the age of 69. His final years marked not by preaching or singing, but by silence. For many, the tragedy was not only in the violence of the shooting, but also in the long, drawn-out period of waiting years caught between life and death, hope and grief. His congregation mourned not just the loss of their pastor, but the cruel way in which his voice had been taken from them long before his body gave way. Franklin's funeral was immense, drawing civil rights leaders, gospel icons, and celebrities. His daughter Aretha sang in tribute, and the service became both a farewell and a celebration of a man whose impact could never be erased. He was remembered as a preacher who redefined the art of the sermon, a leader who stood boldly for justice, and a father whose influence shaped one of the greatest singers of all time. Even decades later, recordings of Franklin's sermons, such as "The Eagle Stirreth, Her Nest," remain classics, studied by preachers and cherished by gospel lovers. His booming voice, preserved on vinyl and tape, continues to inspire, proving that while violence ended his earthly ministry, it could not destroy his legacy. Reverend C.L. Franklin's life is a reminder of both the heights of influence and the depths of vulnerability. He was a man whose voice lifted communities, whose home nurtured legends, and whose tragic end revealed the fragility of even the strongest among us. Though silenced by violence, his words still echo a testament to the power of faith, music, and resilience. Carlton Demetrius Pearson. Bishop Carlton Demetrius Pearson was born on March 19, 1953, in San Diego, California. Gifted with charisma, a sharp mind, and a magnetic voice, he quickly rose through the ranks of Pentecostal circles. By the 1980s, Pearson was no ordinary preacher. He was a rising star who could fill arenas. His church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Higher Dimensions Evangelistic Center, drew crowds by the thousands, eventually boasting a membership of over 5,000 people. He preached on national television, released gospel recordings, and became a household name among believers seeking fiery sermons and uplifting worship. Pearson had the kind of presence that could captivate both seasoned saints and newcomers to the faith. His preaching style blended traditional Pentecostal fire with a touch of sophistication, making him relatable to audiences across backgrounds. He was mentored by the likes of Oral Roberts and often shared the stage with other well-known televangelists, building a platform that placed him among the most influential black pastors of his generation. At his peak, he seemed unstoppable. But in the early 2000s, everything changed. Pearson began preaching what he called the gospel of inclusion, a radical reinterpretation of Christian doctrine that rejected the traditional idea of hell. According to him, God's grace was universal, and all people, regardless of their faith, were already saved through Christ. To his critics, this was heresy. Overnight, he went from being a celebrated pastor to a controversial outcast. His once thriving megachurch dwindled as members left in droves. Colleagues distanced themselves, television appearances disappeared, and funding dried up. Still, Pearson refused to recant. He believed his revelation was worth the cost. He preached in smaller venues, appeared on talk shows, and even had his story dramatized in the 2018 Netflix film Come Sunday, starring Chiwetel Ejiofor as Pearson. The movie introduced his struggle to a new generation, highlighting both his courage and the heavy price he paid for defying orthodoxy. Yet even as the public debate around him simmered, another battle began, this time within his own body. In 2023, Pearson revealed that he had been diagnosed with cancer. He fought bravely, maintaining a positive spirit in public while quietly enduring the toll of the disease. Friends and followers remembered how he tried to comfort them, even as he was the one suffering. But cancer is relentless, and his health declined steadily. On November 19, 2023, Bishop Carlton Pearson died in Tulsa at the age of 70. The official cause was cancer ending a life that had been as complex as it was impactful. For many, his death brought mixed emotions. Some mourned the loss of a trailblazing preacher who had once filled arenas with hope and conviction. Others reflected on the controversies that had defined his later years. But almost everyone agreed Pearson's story was unforgettable. His funeral reflected the tension of his life. Tributes came from those who admired his bravery, while critics remained distant. Yet his legacy is not so easily boxed into categories of hero or heretic. He left behind a reminder of the risks of challenging tradition and the resilience required to stay true to personal conviction. Even now, recordings of his sermons reveal the eloquence and fire that once drew thousands. His name is etched into the story of American Christianity, not only for what he built, but also for what he lost. Bishop Carlton Pearson's journey is both inspiring and tragic, a cautionary tale of the cost of conviction and the inevitability of mortality. In the end, his body was claimed by cancer, but his voice, like his message, loved or hated, still lingers in the hearts of those who heard him. Rance Allen. Bishop Rance Allen was born on November 19, 1948 in Monroe, Michigan, into a modest household where faith was central. By his teenage years, it was already clear he had something extraordinary, a voice unlike any other in gospel music. It wasn't just powerful, it was versatile, capable of soaring falsettos, gritty growls, and soulful runs that left audiences spellbound. For many, hearing Allen sing felt like hearing the impossible. He could twist and bend notes as if music itself bowed to his will. In 1969, along with his brothers Tom and Steve, he formed the Rance Allen Group. Together, they fused gospel with soul, R&B, and even a touch of rock, creating a fresh, modern sound that drew younger listeners into the church. Their breakout came in the 1970s with songs like I Belong to You, and later the unforgettable Something About the Name Jesus. The group became pioneers, proving that gospel didn't have to be confined to traditional formats. It could be vibrant, experimental, and deeply moving. Beyond music, Rance Allen carried himself as a pastor and leader. He eventually became a bishop in the Church of God in Christ Kojic, overseeing congregations and mentoring young ministers. Despite his fame, he remained approachable, known for his warmth and laughter. To many, he was both a superstar and a shepherd, someone who never let celebrity overshadow his calling. His performances were legendary. Audiences often left in disbelief, asking how one man could command so much energy and emotion from a single microphone. Even in his later years, Allen's voice remained remarkably strong, defying age, in a way that made fans believe he would be singing forever. But on October 31, 2020, tragedy struck. At the age of 71, Bishop Rance Allen passed away due to complications from a medical procedure reportedly related to his heart. For a man whose life had been defined by boundless energy, the news was surreal. Fans who had just seen him perform virtually months earlier struggled to process the suddenness of his death. It felt as though an era of gospel innovation had ended overnight. The gospel world erupted in grief. Tributes poured in from legends like Kirk Franklin, Donnie McClurkin, and Yolanda Adams. Franklin, who collaborated with Allen on Something About the Name. Jesus called him a spiritual father and one of the greatest voices in gospel history. Social media flooded with clips of Allen's performances, fans replaying the runs and riffs that had stunned them for decades. His funeral service was a bittersweet celebration. Choirs sang his songs, bishops honored his ministry, and stories were told of a man who never lost his humility despite his fame. For many, the most haunting tribute was the replaying of Something About the Name, Jesus, as Allen's unmistakable voice rang out one last time, filling hearts with equal parts sorrow and gratitude. Allen's death was a reminder of how fragile even the strongest voices can be. He had seemed untouchable, a man whose vocal cords were as resilient as steel, yet one medical complication was enough to silence him. His passing underscored a truth: no matter how gifted, no one escapes mortality. And yet, his legacy continues to blaze. The Rance Allen Group's music remains timeless, influencing generations of gospel and R&B singers. Younger artists still study his vocal techniques, attempting and often failing to mimic his unique sound. His recordings are replayed every Sunday in churches around the world, ensuring his voice never truly leaves. Bishop Rance Allen may no longer walk this earth, but his songs remain as living sermons. In every soaring falsetto and every gritty growl, his spirit still ministers. His life was proof that gospel could evolve without losing its soul, and his death, though sudden, cannot erase the eternal impact of his gift. Andre Crouch. Andre Edward Crouch was born on July 1, 1942 in San Francisco, California, into a modest home where the church was at the center of daily life. From an early age, music was his language of expression. By 10, he was playing the piano for services. By his teens, he was writing songs that carried the depth of Scripture and the rhythm of everyday life. Unlike many of his peers, Crouch's gift was not just in performance, it was in composition. His ability to write melodies that blended tradition with innovation would eventually make him one of the most influential gospel artists in history. By the late 1960s, Crouch had formed Andraé Crouch and the Disciples, a group that redefined what gospel could sound like. Their music was daring for its time, infused with contemporary rhythms, layered harmonies, and instruments rarely used in traditional gospel settings. Songs like My Tribute to God, Be the Glory, and Soon and Very Soon spread far beyond church walls, sung in concerts, crusades, and eventually in congregations around the globe. Crouch's writing carried hope, worship, and accessibility, making gospel approachable to people who had never set foot in a black church. His influence didn't stop there. Crouch became a bridge between sacred and secular worlds. He worked with legends like Michael Jackson on Man in the Mirror, Madonna on Like a Prayer, and even contributed arrangements for major films such as The Lion King and The Color Purple. This crossover success earned him the title the Father of Modern Gospel Music. For him, there was no conflict. His mission was always to spread God's message, even if it meant using contemporary sounds or mainstream platforms. But while his creativity seemed boundless, his body carried quiet battles. Through the years, Crouch faced health struggles, including cancer, diabetes, and other complications. Fans noticed the weariness in his frame, but whenever he stepped onto the stage, he poured himself out as if nothing was wrong. His resilience became part of his testimony, a reminder that calling does not pause when life gets hard. In early 2015, Crouch was hospitalized after suffering from serious heart complications. On January 8, 2015, at the age of 72, he died in Los Angeles from a heart attack, the final blow in a long battle with illness. His passing left the gospel world stunned. Though his health struggles had been no secret, many still hoped he would recover and continue creating. The grief was not limited to gospel circles. Mainstream artists, filmmakers, and fans worldwide mourned the loss of a man whose fingerprints were all over modern music. His funeral was a massive event filled with tributes from both church choirs and global celebrities. Singers lifted his songs in harmony, filling the sanctuary with the very melodies that had defined his career. It was not just a farewell, it was a grand concert of praise, the kind of send-off Crouch himself might have orchestrated. Even after death, his work continues to resonate. His songs are still sung in churches, schools, and concerts around the world. Soon and Very Soon is often heard at funerals, offering hope of eternal reunion, while My Tribute remains one of the most powerful expressions of gratitude in gospel music. Each note reminds listeners of the man who refused to let genre, illness, or time limit his calling. Andraé Crouch's life tells the story of a visionary who dared to push gospel forward without losing its soul. His death, though painful, could not silence the music he left behind. In every choir that lifts his songs, in every film that carries his arrangements, his voice and spirit live on. He was not only a pastor and composer, he was a pioneer, a builder of bridges, and a reminder that the gospel's reach knows no bounds. Edwin Hawkins. Edwin Reuben Hawkins was born on August 18, 1943, in Oakland, California. From an early age, his life was steeped in church music. But unlike many of his peers, Hawkins had a vision gospel could belong not only to sanctuaries, but also to the broader world. That vision would eventually make him one of the most important figures in gospel history. In 1968, Hawkins recorded a modest album with the Northern California State Youth Choir. Among its tracks was a reworked 18th-century hymn titled, "Oh, Happy Day." No one expected it to become a cultural phenomenon. Yet when the song was released, it climbed the Billboard charts and became an international hit, even earning a Grammy Award in 1970. Suddenly, gospel wasn't just a genre for churchgoers, it was on radios, in clubs, and across Europe, introducing millions to a sound they had never encountered before. With his group, the Edwin Hawkins Singers, he continued to innovate. He didn't abandon tradition, but he infused it with fresh arrangements, modern instrumentation, and a joyful spirit that resonated across racial and cultural lines. For many, Hawkins was the first introduction to gospel, and his work opened doors for countless artists to bring sacred music into the mainstream. But fame did not shield him from hardship. In his later years, Hawkins was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, one of the deadliest forms of the disease. Quietly, he endured treatments, but the illness progressed quickly. Still, he remained a source of encouragement, attending events and mentoring younger artists as long as he was able. On January 15, 2018, Edwin Hawkins died at his home in Pleasanton, California at the age of 74. His passing sent shockwaves through the gospel world and beyond. Tributes poured in from pop stars, gospel legends, and church leaders, each acknowledging how Hawkins's vision had touched their lives. "Oh, Happy Day" was replayed across the world, becoming both a hymn of joy and a song of remembrance. His funeral was filled with music, as choirs raised their voices in the very songs he had arranged. The service was less a goodbye and more a continuation of what Hawkins had always believed, that music could be the purest form of worship. Though cancer ended his life, his influence remains boundless. Without Edwin Hawkins, gospel might have remained confined within church walls. Instead, it became global. His work proved that sacred music could inspire not just believers, but anyone with ears to hear joy. Even now, when "Oh Happy Day" plays, the spirit of Hawkins lives on, vibrant, uncontainable, and eternal. Thomas Andrew Dorsey. Thomas Andrew Dorsey was born on July 1, 1899, in Villa Rica, Georgia. Before he became known as the father of gospel music, he was a blues pianist performing in nightclubs and backing blues legends like Ma Rainey. His life seemed destined for secular fame, but tragedy and faith redirected his path. In the early 1930s, Dorsey faced unbearable grief when his wife and infant son died during childbirth. Broken and searching for hope, he turned his sorrow into music. Out of this pain came "Precious Lord, Take My Hand," a hymn that would comfort millions and be sung by artists from Mahalia Jackson to Aretha Franklin, even becoming a favorite of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dorsey had created something new: gospel music, a blend of sacred lyrics with the rhythms and emotion of blues. He didn't stop there. Dorsey composed over 1,000 songs, many of which became church staples, including "Peace in the Valley." His influence was not limited to his compositions. He also trained and inspired future gospel greats, building choirs and nurturing singers who would carry the genre forward. For decades, he was the backbone of gospel, turning personal pain into a legacy of healing for others. Despite his enormous impact, Dorsey lived a long and relatively quiet later life. By the early 1990s, after decades of travel performances and teaching, his health began to decline. Unlike many others whose lives were cut short by violence or sudden illness, Dorsey's passing came after a full, rich life. On January 23, 1993, at the age of 93, he died in Chicago of natural causes. His funeral was a celebration filled with choirs singing his compositions, a fitting tribute to the man who had literally written the soundtrack of modern gospel. Even decades after his passing, his songs remain foundational, taught to children, sung in churches, and recorded by artists around the world. Thomas A. Dorsey's life is proof that out of personal tragedy can come global transformation. He turned heartbreak into a new form of worship, and in doing so gave voice to millions. Though his body rests every time a congregation lifts "Precious Lord" in prayer, Dorsey's legacy breathes again. 15 pastors, 15 endings, some marked by betrayal, others by disease, violence, or sudden collapse. Their stories remind us that even those who dedicate their lives to faith are not immune to life's harshest tragedies. But here's the question: should we remember them for how they died or for how they lived and lifted entire communities? Perhaps the greater legacy lies not in their last breath, but in the sermons, songs, and movements they left behind. What do you think? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us here on Legends of Black Excellence.